Closing out what we were talking about last week, in week one, we were talking about first the theme or themes of the Pentateuch, and then second, the question of authorship of the Pentateuch, and particularly Mosaic authorship. First on the themes, most everyone agreed that sin was a major theme, but of course, sin is a theme in the entire Bible. So want to look a little bit beyond that to some themes that are specific to the Pentateuch itself. Um, the idea here, I mean, obviously there are a lot of themes in the Pentateuch. You could say God, you could say grace, you could say some sense of election, though not necessarily in the Calvinist or Reformed sense fully. Uh, but if we want to look at a main theme that seems to be unique to the Pentateuch, and this kind of goes to the authorship question I'll get to in just a minute. We can look at Genesis 12, 1 through 3, the promise to Abraham. And this is something we're going to get into next week as we look more specifically at Abraham and the patriarchal material. We see there that God comes to Abraham and promises him essentially three things. He promises him land, he promises him seed, that is posterity, that is children, and to make him into a great nation, and then a relationship with Yahweh that's characterized by blessing and curse. Blessing for obedience, curse for disobedience, blessing those who bless him, curse those who curse him. And again, that's something that we're going to get into a little bit more next week. But this is a major theme that we see play out through the entire Pentateuch. We see the rest of Genesis after that, the question of will the promise of the seed come true? And there's a question, will Abraham have a child? And finally, when he does have a child, that child has two children and their relationship is broken. And then finally, by the end of the book and going into Exodus, we see that the promise of the seed is pretty well fulfilled. But then comes the question of the land. Will they get the land? Because again, Genesis outside of the promised land, and the rest of Exodus is spent trying to get back to the promised land. In fact, they don't get to that promised land even at the end of the Deuteronomy, and that they're right on the border. They're getting ready to go in, and Moses dies before he even gets to go in. He gets to see it. So certainly the promise of land, and then the relationship we see in Exodus, a formalization of that relationship. That is, the covenant is established, and how the people will relate to God and how He will relate to them. We see that in Leviticus, more of a formalization. We see some in Numbers, the sense that blessing and curse is there, and we'll get into more of that. So these are themes that run throughout as well. And if we look at the Pentateuch as a fulfillment or a partial fulfillment of that, a fulfillment and a partial unfulfillment of that, and that the promise of the land itself is left in question, doesn't really get answered until Joshua. Then we can see what's kind of a unifying theme or themes running through the entire Pentateuch. And this moves into our discussion on authorship of the text. Obviously, the tradition, and even this is reflected in the New Testament, as a couple of you pointed out pretty well, that the tradition has been that Moses is the author of the Pentateuch, or at least he's primarily responsible for it. I mean, there's some elements that we can see in there, like the account of Moses' death, that probably weren't written by him, but at the very least we can say that he's responsible for the material in some way, shape, or form. Of course, critical scholarship, starting really even before the 19th century, but really in the 19th century is where it really hit its peak. The question of what's a documentary hypothesis, as it's called. Wellhausen popularized it, although he wasn't the first to come up with it. And the idea here is that the Pentateuch is made up of several distinct sources, different sources that were complete and distinct in and of themselves, that were just slapped together and thrown out there. And of course, a key element of the documentary hypothesis is that we can identify the sources and then separate them out. Well, it's a confusing mess, and it is a mess. There's a lot of weaknesses to the documentary hypothesis. I'm not going to get into all of them here because there's in your reading, but first of all, no one can agree on how many sources there are, what are the sources, what material belongs to what source, what criteria we should use to determine what goes to one source. No one can agree on that. This is something that even those scholars who are still trying to hold to something of a documentary hypothesis have been arguing about for the last 200 years. And as long as this is up, there's going to be debate. So it's not clear. This is based on subjective assumptions about the text that can't be tested because we've never found any, ironically enough, documentary proof of the documentary hypothesis. J, E, D, and P are the four supposed sources, and we've never found an independent J or an independent E or an independent D. The earliest evidence we have is a complete and total Pentateuch together. The earliest traditions we have talk about the 5 books of Moses, and so the earliest textual and other evidence that we have is this complete whole. We have absolutely no outside evidence, period, of separate documentary sources. And this is one of the reasons that a lot of critical scholars are even moving away from the documentary hypothesis per se towards more of a supplemental or fragment hypothesis. But both of those have many of the same weaknesses in that we have no objective outside evidence that these ever existed. They're based on assumptions that these scholars make, and then they read those assumptions back into the text and come up with their theories. And of course, this is very circular. It's problematic. And we, as evangelicals who hold to a Mosaic authorship or responsibility of the Pentateuch, should have no problem saying that the documentary hypothesis does not hold water. Of course, we need to be conversant in that. We need to be able to just, we don't want to just say, well, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. But we do want to be able to say, look, there are serious weaknesses. For instance, different names of God. Well, even now, people have eliminated that as a reason for choosing. Even those who hold to some form of the documentary hypothesis recognize that even the names of God isn't a good enough way to determine who wrote what. In fact, we see in other writings from antiquity, from this time in the ancient Near East, that gods had many names, many titles. We look at the Law Code of Hammurabi. The beginning of it lists that he got this code from a god, and it lists a whole bunch of titles for that god here in one source. And no one, of course, would argue that multiple sources are behind that. It's just that the gods were known by different names. We do that same thing today. Sometimes we call God God. Sometimes we call him Lord. Sometimes we call him Yahweh. So we call Jesus Jesus. Sometimes we call him Christ. Sometimes we call him the Messiah. Sometimes we call him Jesus Christ. It's just the way people talk, to assume that we can look at that as a criteria for different sources is really wishful thinking to a lot of extent. It's really wanting to get to a certain place, a very circular reasoning. So that's just one of many reasons. And I think one of the biggest arguments against the documentary hypothesis is what I mentioned before, the unity of theme in the Pentateuch. If we look at the Pentateuch and look at it through the lens of, for instance, the Abrahamic promise, we see that it does seem to have a coherent story that's linked by this theme of the fulfillment and partial unfulfillment of the Abrahamic promise. The question of will it be fulfilled at the end of Deuteronomy? They're still not in the promised land, but that hope is there. And so there's good reason to hold to a unity of the Pentateuch. And if we hold to that unity, then there's no reason to dismiss out of hand the fact that Moses might have been responsible for it. Now, is it possible that Moses wrote and then he supervise some other writing? Yes, of course. Is it possible that he wrote and then someone came along later and edited a little bit to smooth out some things, to add some other things like the death of Moses? Yes, of course, that's possible. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the driving force of the Pentateuch was Moses, and that it is a unified whole that should be read as such. And of course, it doesn't take away from the inspiration and the authority of the text. The documentary hypothesis absolutely does. The documentary hypothesis would say that a lot of this stuff was written well after the fact. They made up stuff, so this isn't real. None of this really happened, and of course, that takes away from the authority and the inspiration of the text, and we can't accept that. But we don't refuse to accept it simply because we have blinders on and refuse to see the facts. No, the facts support our position. As much more than the facts support the documentary hypothesis or other theories like that.